Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia program at CEPA, and I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual conversation on oil, guns, and imperialism. Do energy prices influence Russian foreign policy behavior? And to frame our discussion, I'd like to begin with some brief observations. The Russian economy, as they say, rests on two pillars: oil and gas. When energy prices are high, Russia's coffers are flush. And when energy prices are low, Russia's cupboard is bare. So it stands to reason, at least according to the conventional wisdom, that with oil prices at 2-decade lows, the Kremlin will be forced to scale back its foreign policy ambitions in the very near future. Imperialism, after all, is very expensive. Now, the problem with this theory is that there actually is very little limited empirical evidence to support the hypothesis. There is, of course, the experience of the last oil glut in the 1980s and 1990s, which coincided with glasnost, perestroika, and the less expansionist Soviet foreign policy. And there was the dramatic rise in energy prices in the first decade of the 21st century, which also coincided with a more assertive and revanchist Russian foreign policy under Vladimir Putin. So basically, there's an N of two. But are these two data points sufficient? And what can we expect from Russia in what appears to be a prolonged period of low energy prices? With that, I will introduce our guests. Maria Snegovaya is a fellow with CEPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Maria is also, incidentally, the author of a scholarly article published in the journal Problems of Post-Communism late last year that in part inspired this event. Also, Angela Stent is with us. Angela Stent is the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies at Georgetown University and author of the recently published and highly recommended book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Angela also served in the Office of Policy Planning of the United States State Department and as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. So welcome all. And so the way I want to structure this is to keep it interactive and to do a couple of rounds of questions with our panelists before we field questions from our virtual audience. So I'd ask our panelists to keep your remarks as brief as possible. Maria, let's begin with you. Late last year, you published a thought-provoking article in the scholarly journal Problems of Post-Communism, looking at the relationship between oil prices and Russian foreign policy rhetoric. Now, this was an empirical study that looked at a lot of data. And to get us rolling, Maria, could you briefly summarize your findings for us?
Thank you very much, Brian and Angela, for joining this talk. Definitely an honor for me. Pavel Bayev, a famous Russian political scientist, in his book on Russia's foreign policy, cites one Russian official who said, when oil prices are $20 per barrel, we are a raw material appendage. When they are 60, we are an energy superpower. And that is, I claim in my argument, a commonly ignored element, important element of Russia's foreign policy that tends to be much more, behaving much more like a typical petrostate than usually given credit to. So petrostates are the countries that in the literature are typically defined as those whose state budget revenues are largely generated from the oil and natural gas. Economic political power concentrated in the hands of a small elite group, and political institutions are weak and corruption is widespread. So it's not very democratic states or states with relatively weak political institutions. And with regards to those countries, petrostates, the literature has established very interesting phenomenon known as petroaggression. That is, petrostates are on average more likely to engage in military conflicts than ordinary countries. As a matter of fact, Colgan, for example, showed that on average for a petrostate, the odds of unleashing an interstate conflict is 250% higher, so 2.5 times higher than for an ordinary country, so to speak. Similarly, for example, Ken Hendricks also showed that this relationship is conditional on the price of oil. The higher the oil price is, the more likely the petrostate is to get aggressive. For example, compared to the average price in his data set of $34 per barrel in 2008 dollars, the increase of price of oil by one standard deviation of about $20 actually has a 30% chance for petrostates to increase in an international dispute. I have to say that the literature on petrostates is not perfect in the sense that the causal relationship is not very well established. So we know that the petrostates get aggressive, but we are not sure why. We can only make certain hypotheses. For example, the very fact that the political accountability is low, by definition, these are the country with weak political institutions, weak accountability, and at the same time, this leadership experiences this huge influx in commodity revenues, make them essentially more likely to dream. This is literally a quote from King of Libya, Idris, who said, oil is more likely to make you dream. Interestingly, Brown actually made this analysis of Russia's Politburo thinking in 1979 about invasion of Afghanistan before and after oil price increase happened. And he shows very interesting change of mind among the Soviet at the time leadership that actually was very, very cautious in its geopolitical ambitions at first at about $17 per barrel. But then, so in January 1979, but in November, once oil prices jumped up to $40 per barrel in November 1979, suddenly they were extremely ambitious and ready to risk and enter Afghanistan. Along with Afghanistan, another example of Russia's invasion is, of course, Ukraine and Georgia. In both cases, those occurred under higher than average oil prices, so that is consistent with the theory. By contrast, early on, we remember Putin, when he first came to power and the oil prices were around $20 per barrel in constant 2008 dollars. Then, of course, he was extremely at least much more pro-Western as his political standing, and even mentioned Russia potentially joining the European Union in the future. Then in 2014, then the oil prices peaked. He actually invaded Ukraine to punish Ukraine for trying to enter the European Union. But for better or worse, honestly, for better, for the post-Soviet space of Russia, we still don't have as many incidents of Russia's incursions or invasions. In this sense, it's impossible from this political science perspective to create a data set to analyze this dynamic. In addition, typically scientists also use federal budget revenues, but in the Russian case, a lot of the articles are classified, and so we probably significantly underestimate the real size of the defense spending in the Russian case. So therefore, I actually used a definitely unusual approach in this literature, classifying the aggressiveness or assertiveness of the foreign policy rhetoric of the Russian president. To do so, me with the 3 students from Russia's High School of Economics, we created a data set of foreign policy speeches by Russian presidents from 2000 to 2016, so including both Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. Then out of this corpus of speeches, about 70,000 total, we classified manually as assertive in terms of foreign policy about 400 sentences in this data set. Then substantively and then we trained the computer program using the Wall-2-WEC model to classify the rest of the sentences as assertive. And this returned us a data set of about 12,000 sentences classified as assertive over the span of 67 quarters. So this is a data set with which you can work. And I connected those, the fluctuation in the assertiveness in the speeches. The assertiveness in the speeches was measured as share of assertive sentences per speech, with common factors used in foreign policy and international relations literature as explanations for Russia's assertiveness on international stage, including year of the NATO expansion, including Putin's approval rating. This is rally around the flag effect. There's a lot of literature that argues that Putin tends to get more aggressive when his ratings fall, including the economic growth. The oil price, the oil dynamic was measured through the average export price and crude oil exports overall using the Russian central bank data. And as a result, as my article shows, the only consistent factor that really is related to assertiveness of Russia's president's speeches in an unexpected way is the dynamic of the oil prices or the crude oil budget revenues. In this sense, the petrostate aggression theory seems to be confirmed. However, of course, there's a number of possible limitations with this theory, and it's important to keep in mind that we're only looking at this dynamic from a very short-term angle, so future research is needed.
Hey, thank you, Maria. And yeah, it was a fascinating article with a lot of data. And if I could encapsulate your argument, you're effectively saying the data does show a strong relationship between Russian aggressive foreign policy rhetoric and the oil price. Now we have a couple of data points about behavior. You noted the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Georgia, which incidentally came right before oil prices fell following the 2008 financial crisis, and the invasion of Ukraine. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the relationship, and I know this is kind of goes a little bit outside of what the topic of our discussion, but foreign and domestic politics are related. And the oil price effectively also affects Russia's domestic stability. Putin's ability, or any Russian leader's ability, to provide a rising standard of living to the Russian population is also affected by the oil prices. Do you see domestic implications of this? Did you come across this in your research at all? And do you see maybe a knockoff effects on foreign policy for these domestic implications for this? Because it's not necessarily always a one-to-one relationship. You can have multiple causality. So I was wondering if you could address that
a bit. That's a question for me, right? Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yes, when it comes to the situation with domestic policy, of course, as we know, authoritarian regimes tend to either co-opt or repress the public in order to ensure support. So when the oil prices are high, the regime definitely has much more resources to co-opt the domestic opposition, and hence, in some ways, domestically much more opposition oil groups. So in this sense, domestically is much more established and strong. In addition, honestly, Henry Hale actually has a very recent article where he ran a sort of experiment, essentially showing certain information about oil prices to the Russian elites. And he finds that elites who think that the oil prices going to be lower, they actually expect that the United Russia will be ousted in the next 10 years. They're more likely to expect that the United Russia will be weaker in the next several years. I actually, as we speak right now, has a very similar experiment being run with the help of Sharon Rivera on the international policy, with regards to the international policy. So essentially, yes, the regime definitely understands that domestically it's weaker when the oil prices are lower. And of course, the recent experience, especially the collapse of the Soviet Union, and of course, the famous Gaidar book, The Decline or the Collapse of the Empire, he describes precisely the same dynamic, that the budgets get overexpended, and then essentially because of the quality of the governance in Russia, once the oil prices are low, the ability to sustain that is low as well. I have to say, however, the Russian regime today is quite aware of this dynamic. One can probably say that's one of the biggest threats that it has. So of course, we know we have the budget rule, and the sustainability of the Russian budget today is much better than it used to be in the Soviet times.
Thank you, Marina. I mean, you could easily see how that could cut either way, because on one hand, lower oil price means lower resources, and lower resources means scaling back foreign policy ambitions. But you could also see lower oil prices causing the regime to get in trouble domestically and using foreign adventure to basically resolve their domestic difficulties. Angela, let's move beyond the rhetoric and take a look at behavior. Because in a lot of ways, we all think we've seen this movie before, right? We all remember the effect of the oil glut of the 1980s and 1990s on the Soviet Union. But we also know that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself. It doesn't even necessarily rhyme. And we also may not be seeing the same movie again, because unlike in the 80s and 90s, Russia has, by my last count, $562 billion in foreign exchange reserves, which gives it something of a cushion, at least for a little while. Russia today also has become much more adept than the Soviet Union was at low-cost imperialism. The use of things like disinformation, organized crime, active measures, mercenary groups like Wagner to advance its foreign policy goals. So do we have reason to believe that Russian revanchism might survive this oil glut?
Thank you very much for that question, Brian, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel with you and Maria. So yes, I'm tempted to quote the title of a recent book on the 2008 financial crisis. This time it's really different. I'm going to start off just with an anecdote. In 2006, the Valdai International Club, the theme was energy, and they took us to Khanty-Mansiysk. They took us to the Priovsky oil field, which was the jewel in the crown of Yukos, now the jewel in the crown of Rosneft. And by the way, some of the hard hats, they had forgotten to put a new sticker on them, and they still said Yukos. Anyway, at the dinner we then had with President Putin, I asked him if Russia is an energy superpower. He first of all said, well, you know, energy superpower, that's really a Cold War term, and we don't like to use that anymore. But he said, I've never referred to Russia as an energy superpower, but we do have greater possibilities than almost any other country in the world. This is an obvious fact. Everyone should understand that these are, above all, our natural resources, and they should not start looking at them as their own. So that's the kind of, we're an energy superpower, we have a lot of energy, and don't think those resources are yours. And I do think that in that kind of period, I'm talking 2006, as oil prices were rising all the time, this definitely fueled Russia's sense of its right and ability to return as a great power. Let me just give a couple of historical points then to come to the question, is this time different? So you obviously have under Gorbachev, $12 oil. You have much more cooperative relations with the West. You have in the end the Soviet collapse, of course. And of course, there's some Russians who believe that there was a plot between the United States and Saudi Arabia at that point to keep oil prices down. Life doesn't work like that. The second data point obviously is Yeltsin. Again, low oil prices, a more cooperative policy with the West. I read Maria's article with great interest. I think, as she herself said, one shouldn't imply causation here too much. Yes, there's a coincidence at this period, but both Gorbachev and Yeltsin were leaders who came into power wanting to improve ties to the West. Part of that was economic. They realized their economies were in bad shape, and less tension with the West and more cooperation could maybe help them economically. That, of course, was also true at some points in the Brezhnev era. Then Putin comes in. In the beginning, you did have a more cooperative policy with the West. Oil prices were beginning to rise. As we know, they got to $140 in 2008. Just to remind you, you have the invasion of Georgia, and then 1 month later, Lehman Brothers collapses and oil prices collapse. And so don't forget and then of course, Medvedev comes in, oil prices are sinking, you have a more cooperative relationship with the West. But again, as we understand it, that was one of the things on Medvedev's agenda when he became president, when the switch occurred, that he was given really a blessing, at least in the beginning, to improve ties with the West. We have seen a pattern, and clearly there is a coincidence between lower oil prices and better relations with the West, but it is not a perfect one. Let me come on to a question that Maria raises in her article, which is, will lower prices lead to a less adventurous Russian foreign policy? Oil prices are very low today, we know. A couple of weeks ago, they were zero or -0. Now they've recovered a little bit, but they're clearly not going to recover very much as long as this pandemic is on. Demand has collapsed. Russia doesn't have that much storage space for oil. And of course, it's now in this agreement with OPEC, and an agreement, of course, brokered by the United States. And that is that everyone's supposed to cut back their production by 20% as of May 1. I checked today, I think this is beginning, but obviously this is going to take some time. But, and I think you mentioned this, Brian, we have to remember this isn't, 1989, this isn't 1997. Russia is better equipped today to deal with these low oil prices because, as Brian said, it has over $500 billion in reserves. It will have to spend some of that down during this COVID period, but that's still pretty robust. And we have a floating ruble exchange rate, which also makes it easier for Russia to deal with it. So we are in a different situation. And I think all of the experts on this say Russia is much better equipped to deal with this than, say, it was in any of the previous oil price collapses since the post-Soviet period. So the other point, which is very important, is, and why this is different, most of Russian foreign policy today is done pretty much on the cheap. Afghanistan was mentioned. This is not a war, Russia isn't involved in an enterprise as it was a very costly war in Afghanistan. What does it do? Militarily, it contracts out a lot of what it's doing to Wagner, to other private military groups, be it Ukraine, be it Syria, be it Africa, be it Venezuela. So this isn't costing the state coffers that much money. Election interference, that's pretty cheap. You just have to have some troll factories. If you watch the recent CNN report, you've got young people in Ghana sitting in a small house doing all the social media stuff vis-a-vis the United States and racial issues. So that's not very costly to do the kinds of social media and other kinds of domestic interference and destabilizing measures that Russia is taking now. And so there are few, I would say, economic incentives at the moment to change Russia's foreign policy. In other words, even this precipitous collapse in oil prices, it's not, at the moment, you're not at the point where the leadership is going to rethink, do we really want to be doing what we're doing in Ukraine or what we're doing in Syria? I don't think that will cause them to do that. I think what you can say is, if you had a leadership that thought about this rationally, there's clearly an argument to be made, say, for having a more cooperative relationship with the West, if you really wanted to get some sanctions relieved. And sanctions relief would help Russia, even though it's not in a dire situation at the moment. There are a number of European countries that would be very happy to start removing sanctions. They've said so out loud: Hungary, Italy, a number of other countries. And for that, Russia wouldn't have to do that much. You have a few more prisoner exchanges with Ukraine. You maybe remove some more troops and equipment behind the border back to Russia. And yet we don't really see very much of that happening now, which is interesting, because that would clearly lead the Europeans to begin lifting some of the sanctions. It's more complicated with the United States, because our congressionally mandated sanctions are much more difficult to lift. You could also, however, see a scenario where, if the Russians attenuated some of the election interference that we're seeing now, social media interference, at least there wouldn't be more sanctions. And possibly there could be, at the margin, some sanctions relief. Again, we don't see that happening at the moment. So, and then the final point, again, to come back to what Maria was suggesting in her article, and Brian just mentioned too, would a Russia that's in tightened economic straits in fact pursue a more aggressive foreign policy, to have another Kremlin, to have, arouse popular enthusiasm? Putin's popularity ratings, according to Levada, it's 59% now, lower than it's been since before the annexation of Crimea. Could we see another foreign adventure coming? I personally don't really see that. But what I could see is, in fact, intensified election interference in the United States if the leadership decides, everyone's in terrible shape, the US hasn't handled this well, let's just aid and abet all the polarization there. So I think that's something to watch for. I would be more skeptical about, another military incursion somewhere else.
Thank you, Angela. And I wanted to just remind our audience that if you wanted to ask a question to our panelists, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're following us on Twitter, you can also ask a question in Twitter. Now, Angela, I definitely see at the moment what appears at least to be a little bit more of a confident Russia despite the falling oil price. And I think a lot of this is borne out by the negotiations, the OPEC Plus deal, where in the short term, Russia appeared to be willing to let the oil price fall in hopes that it would harm US shale producers, even though it would also harm Russia. Now, at the end of the day, they had to accept basically a bad deal for them on OPEC plus, but that was a bit of an indication to me that they're feeling a little bit confident. I also wanted, Angela, to switch with you a little bit to domestic politics, as I did with Maria. Anybody that knows my work, I don't think you can separate Russian domestic politics from its foreign policy behavior. And the effect of oil prices on Putin's social compact with the Russian people. I mean, Putin basically rose as the guy that rose the living standards for average Russians higher than they've probably ever been for the average Russian. And now we're seeing the effect of that. You mentioned the Levada poll. That 59% number is actually the lowest Putin has ever recorded as president. You have to go back to his time as prime minister. The first time around, before he was president at all, in 1999, to see approval ratings lower than now. So how do you see the oil price affecting the social compact and in turn foreign policy?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to, for 1 minute, go back to what you said at the beginning. I think if you look at what happened with the Russian-Saudi deal at the beginning of March, remember, Igor Sechin has never liked the Russian OPEC deal. He has said, you know, once you cut back on production, you never get the market share back. So I think when we talk about Russia, we have to look at what happened at the beginning of March as Sechin apparently being able to prevail and persuade Putin that Russia should not adhere to what the Saudis wanted, which was further cutbacks. We know what the result of that was. It was pretty bad for Russia. And so I think looking forward, it'll be interesting to see what happens, let's say, to inter-elite relations in terms of the oil industry. So I do think that Putin has had this social compact with the Russian people for most of the time he's been in office. If you don't question me politically, if you don't cause trouble, your standard of living will rise and you will be better off. And for the first 8 years in office, that happened. I mean, people's standard of living did rise, and even people who didn't support the regime said, yeah, we're better off. Now that's not happening. And we see more, if you look again at the polls, there's, people who don't trust President Putin and who have negative views about what's happening. This is certainly going up. And that social compact, it began to break down after 2014, obviously with all of the post-Ukraine sanctions and the collapse in oil prices. And at that point, the Kremlin-watchers, the rally around the flag, worked. I'm not sure that that's really going to work this time. If you have a combination of people's standard of living falling, and then more and more doctors and medical personnel in Russia openly saying, we don't have the equipment, we can't deal with this. You've had doctors dying there, as in other countries. And so there's, I think, much more questioning of the Kremlin's ability to handle this. You see President Putin, who's kind of taken himself off to his house and staying there and trying to remove himself from what's going on in terms of the COVID, and letting Sobyanin and Mishustin take care of that. Yes, he ventured out on Saturday alone for May 9th to lay the bouquet of flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier and made a very somber speech. But I think he's trying to portray himself as being above the fray and not being responsible for what's happening in Russia. And I think that's a pretty combustible set of circumstances. And so I think as the social compact maybe becomes more fragile, I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens domestically.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, and you mentioned the elite politics. I agree with you about Sechin, and I think the consensus within the elite is that Sechin screwed up here. And I'm wondering if there's going to be repercussions for this. He seems to have 9 lives and seems to be untouchable. We'll see just how untouchable he is. And again, I am watching closely how this is playing out domestically. Putin's appearance on Victory Day was his first appearance in a month, and then he gave a COVID speech yesterday where he opened up the economy effectively, and right around the same time, Russia recorded over 11,000 cases in a single day, moving to 3rd place on the world list of the most cases. Let's go to our audience questions now. We have an interesting question from Jonathan Chapman. Is there a relationship between the collapse in oil prices and Russia's intervention in Syria? Now, that intervention initially happened in September 2015. Syria is not a very significant oil producer compared to other neighboring states. Does Russia see its bases there as critical to influencing oil markets, or is it more attributable to geopolitical opportunism? I have my own thoughts about that, but Angela, I think this is your wheelhorse.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think most of this is attributable to geopolitical calculations. I mean, the main reason why Russia intervened in 2015 was because the Assad regime was in danger of being defeated. Yes, Russia does obviously have bases there, 2 major bases, and it wanted to retain those. It clearly wanted Assad to stay in power. And I think the oil price factor was less important then. So I mean, Russia's interests in the Middle East are, of course, connected to oil issues, and particularly its relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran as well, I would say. But I would say in the Syrian case, I don't see that much of an energy connection there.
Maria, would you agree with that? And does your research take into account the intervention in Syria?
Syria is important, and thank you for this question. I do agree with Angela that, to me as well, the getting under control oil reserves there was not the key element of intervention, but it's important to keep in mind that definitely that was part of the story, and all of the Kremlin's the Kremlin's view of the world politics, of the geopolitics, actually does have to do a lot with the control over the oil reserves, and definitely the Kremlin interprets the American actions on the world stage, for example, as a result of these efforts. So definitely an attempt to get certain oil reserves under control in Syria has been at least part, maybe not, definitely not the key one, but at least part of the effort there. I also wanted to comment on the weakness of today's, so not weakness, but cheapness. So this non-linear war that Russia implements today. Overall, definitely that makes the whole oil theory less applicable, since the whole idea to have more reserve, to have more money to pay for the international advantage, for international adventures, is not as applicable anymore, because you just don't need that money. The interference is relatively cheap. At the same time, we do understand that there might be certain softening on the Russian side as its budget has more revenues, or as the threats or perception of the future threats increases. Just that Russia is not there yet. You can argue that there were certain negotiations, for example, about the situation in Venezuela, and Rosneft officially sort of restructured its presence there, for example, in an effort to avoid future sanctions on the US side as part of this strategy. So unfortunately, we're still in the middle of this process, but overall, of course, despite the fact that the nonlinear war is very cheap, there's still a very direct relationship there, in the sense that when and if the Russian budget feels threatened, we're just not there yet. And the expectation is that the oil prices will keep rising eventually, even after this coronavirus crisis. In that situation, we have to see the softening on the Kremlin's stances geopolitically, if this theory still holds, even if today's nonlinear war is not necessarily related on the intervention. And ultimately, once more comment on the OPEC deal. It's Second, but there's also increasing understanding among Russia's oil analysts that it's getting tougher and tougher for them to control the oil prices, because of the presence of the shale and oil gas, and because there's so many, the market of the oil has changed so much in the recent years. So Second is to blame, but a lot of our Russian analysts I spoke to, they also mentioned that there's longer term understanding that as long as shale and oil gas are there, they're losing the main leverage, the control over the prices. In this sense, this is the first attempt to essentially to return things back to normal by trying to destroy the U.S. shale and oil producers. Probably not going to be sustainable this time, but there is growing understanding in the Kremlin that the oil market is changing, and I wanted to point that out.
Oh, thank you, Maria. No, and I mean, the conventional wisdom is that Russia needs oil prices to be at about $40 a barrel in order to be able to meet their budgetary needs. I checked the price just before we went on this morning. It's in the high 20s at the moment, which is significantly lower than 40, but significantly higher than like the zero it was a couple of weeks ago. Marie, here's a good question that kind of follows up on some of your research. It comes from Eleanor, our colleague at CEPA, Eleanor Anderson. Eleanor asks, have there been similar patterns of scaling back aggressive or authoritarian policies in response to low oil prices in other authoritarian countries other than the Soviet Union in the 1980s? You mentioned the Saudi example in your research. Anything else you came across?
Venezuela, for example, there's definitely, thank you for a great question. Yes, there's a lot of examples of similar behavior on the part of countries in Latin America, for example, gets more expansionist and increase their posture internationally. Venezuela will be one example. Middle Eastern countries, multiple examples there as well. By the way, the partners hold not just international but also domestically. That links us back, Brian, to your earlier question. I mentioned the Paris, for example, the president who actually started investing in huge infrastructure projects as a result of the oil price boost, but substantially, of course, all of that had to scale down. Again, that's a Venezuelan case. Overall, this project honestly started as an attempt to compare Venezuela to Russia. You see a lot of similarity in the international and domestic policy among the two countries, but eventually actually switched.
Great, thank you, Maria. Angela, did you want to follow up on anything there? No? Okay. Let's go to there's an interesting question from Christina Forstner. Should we in the West be interested in stabilizing Russia and the Putin regime, or in causing more troubles through sanctions, deterrence, and decoupling in order to trigger reforms? Angela, you want to tackle that one?
Go, yeah. So that's the eternal question, right? What is it that we would like to see happening in Russia? So you first of all have to start, how interested should we be in a destabilized Russia that has still a large number of nuclear warheads? And so, the answer to that is we probably shouldn't be interested in an unstable Russia with these nuclear weapons where we really don't know what would happen. Now, the better answer is we would prefer to have a stable Russia, but one in which, one which is less repressive. And by the way, one of which is more willing to build really the institutions of a modern state and get away from, what Maria has described, the petro state. This is a highly personalistic regime. In Russia, again, we can compare it to other authoritarian states. So a less personalistic, a more maybe institutionalized and less repressive. Now, it's easy to say that, it's not easy to do it. But I think we should be pursuing policies that would try and move Russia in that direction, always recognizing that we have very limited influence over what happens inside Russia. But I think pursuing policies that either, sanctions that either cause the Russian people, to be much worse off, or that would cause an adverse reaction by groups that we know exist in Russia that are much more, if you like, militant, that's not a good idea.
Just got an interesting question came over. Thank you, Angela, from Tracy Rue. Do you have any thoughts on how this could be affecting industries in the near term and further out, and will affect foreign policy, possibly, for example, the effect on the defense industry? That's an interesting question. It's an angle I haven't really thought about, but other than oil and gas, the Russian defense industry is the next biggest part of the Russian economy. And how can oil and gas prices not affect the defense industry? I was wondering if either of you could weigh in on that.
There is definitely a relationship between the oil budget revenues and the and the defense budget. That's for sure. And in this sense, unfortunately, it's just that the Russian budget data isn't great, but overall, there were multiple attempts to establish this relationship as well. And it's important to keep in mind that we can think of geopolitical assertiveness as a sort of a luxury good using the economic terms. So this is something that you do when you have met your basic needs. The basic needs being establishing certain economic growth in the country, providing certain basic levels of the social services and so on. And in this sense, the countries that are petrostates specifically less likely, so they have, when the oil prices peak, this trade-off between the guns and butter, so to speak, between spending money for the military budget or spending for the social spending, it goes away because now they have money to fund both. Once the oil prices are lower, they have to make those difficult decisions. And the question is, what is the society willing to tolerate? How much is it willing to tolerate? Overall, the dynamic is that, of course, we see that the defense budgets also grow as the oil revenues increase, but that's, again, a much more interesting situation. What happens under the situation of constraints? So I actually also did this recent study about the preferences of the Russian population these days. Again, this goes back to the question about the domestic policy. And so the interesting dynamic that we have been seeing for quite some time is that on the polls, the Russian population actually starts prioritizing the social spending much more than the spending on so to speak, military budgets. That is because they see that the economic situation is worsening and the priorities shift back from the so-called luxury good towards satisfaction of the basic primary needs. As the situation continues, we will definitely see, as the economic stagnation continues, unfortunately, in Russia, for Russia, it's not going anywhere. So the situation economically is probably not going to improve. We are going to see this tension for the Kremlin, where it will have to prioritize, will have to make a decision, and this is where low oil prices hopefully will create this interesting choices for the Kremlin, which again will probably ideally help scale down its geopolitical ambitions.
No, and something to bear in mind here is it's not always just a question between like social spending, domestic spending, and defense spending, because the arms industry for Russia, after oil and gas, is the largest source of revenues from foreign arms sales. And it's a relationship I hadn't really thought through it. Excellent question. Here's another one I think we will all have something to say about. It comes from Maria Shagina, and the question is, what are the implications of low oil prices in COVID-19 for the Sino-Russian relationship in light of Russia's growing dependence on China's energy demand and financing? How will this affect the dynamic between the two? I mean, I always looked at this, that China basically had Russia over a barrel because it was all because China could effectively almost dictate the prices to Russia, and this was even when prices were high. So any thoughts on that, Maria or Angela?
Sure, I'll start. So I think that when Russia comes out of this pandemic, it's going to be more dependent on China than it is now. We see at the very beginning of the pandemic, the Russians actually closed the border with China very early. The Chinese were not happy about this. And in general, the Chinese have not been happy also about the way that, for instance, Chinese students, Chinese people who are in Russia have been treated. You know, we've had some of the same incidents in our country. But as the pandemic has gotten worse and Russia has realized that it needs help, it's now, you know, Putin has said explicitly, we want to work with the Chinese. The Chinese are sending them equipment. They're sending physicians. They're sending help to Russia to try and deal with this. And so, and I think the Chinese have also looked at the way the Russians have handled this and taken some lessons from this. So even though you've seen on one level, a more antagonistic Chinese-Russian relationship at the very beginning of this and trying to deal with this, I think Russia will come out of this, as I say, probably more dependent on China, particularly if there isn't an improvement in ties with the West. And so, you know, I think we'll certainly see this going forward.
Maria, would you agree with that?
Actually, I agree. I think that the strategic choices that the Kremlin elites have made certain times ago, they actually constrain them. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why we don't see, probably as a hypothesis, a strong enough impact of sanctions or those same oil prices on softening Kremlin stances towards the West. And the important reason is this so-called Eastern turn, which conditions the Kremlin's behavior in different regards. The Kremlin elites are convinced that their longer-term survival is dependent on cooperation with China. They think that Western elites will eventually want some alternation of power in Russia, and that is not something Putin and his elites are ready to accept. As a matter of fact, I think, Brian, you have a great article last week about possible assistance that Russia may provide China in this disinformation campaign designed to essentially shift the blame for the spread of COVID-19 away from China. So in this sense, the unfortunate reality as of now, once again, now that the Kremlin still feels relatively comfortable, now that the reserves are still high for the Kremlin, and there is no pressuring need economically to substantively alternate relationships with the West, the trend will continue, and perhaps, as Angela said, will even deepen.
Hey, thank you. Now we have a couple of questions related to the conflict in Ukraine, the effect of energy prices on the war in Ukraine. Again, from CEPA's Eleanor Anderson, do you think the current low oil price will impact the Kremlin's war in the Donbass or their increasing militarization of Crimea? Related to that, from Peter Borisov, what is the significance, if any, of Ukraine's substantial gas storage facilities as a potential target for Russia? Either of those questions, either of our panelists. Angela, you want to?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen any attenuation of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine since all of this began. Obviously, you know, it's having an impact. Ukraine has its own problems, clearly, with COVID, and it's dealing with a pandemic too. But we haven't really seen, you know, it hasn't caused the social distancing or whatever hasn't caused a decrease in the hostilities there. I'm not sure that Ukraine's gas storage facilities, I don't see that necessarily as a target of Russia. I mean, don't forget, Russia and Ukraine did conclude a gas deal at the last moment in December. And so, you know, you still have Russian gas flowing through Ukraine. At least the agreement is for the next 5 years. So I don't see much of an impact there. And as I said, you know, theoretically, you could say the Russian government should rethink what it's doing in Ukraine, you know, for economic reasons, but we don't see that happening. And as we know, none of the sanctions so far have had any impact really on what Russia's doing in Ukraine, except perhaps at the beginning to have prevented them from doing more. So I don't see much of an impact there.
Yeah, no, it is remarkable. One has to think of how, you know, how COVID affects what is effectively a hot conflict. Maria, did you want to jump in on that as well in Ukraine?
Just a small question. The problem with trying to understand the impact of sanctions on the Kremlin's foreign policy is the counterfactual, right? The absence of it. So we tend to assume that they did not alternate the Kremlin's behavior, but we don't know what would have happened if sanctions were not in place to begin with. So it's possible that the Kremlin's escalation and deep into Ukraine would have gone further, have they not faced certain resistance to their adventurism. It is also possible that the whatever unstructured and not very successful political development is happening right now in Ukraine, it would have even further impeded through the Kremlin's continued intervention. So in this sense, I'm not as skeptical of sanctions. I think they did stop possible further escalation. Unfortunately, they were not sufficient to completely kick out the Kremlin from Ukraine. But then again, it's important to remember that the sanctions are relatively carefully designed and they're not as harmful for the Kremlin in the short term. They delay the growth, but they don't necessarily destroy the growth in Russia. And most of them are longer term rather than short term in nature.
All right, thank you. And we seem to have a very active audience today. Lots of questions coming in. One directed directly at you, Angela. A question to Angela Stent. Thank you for your talk. This comes from Salome Pacoria. Thank you for your talk. If possible, could you elaborate on something you mentioned towards the end of your remarks, where you said that even though, according to the Levada Center, Putin's approval ratings are lower than in 2014, they're in fact lower than at any point in his presidency, you don't see another foreign adventure coming. Is that because Putin can work on increasing his approval ratings by other non-military and more cost-effective means, like interference in the US elections? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that because of I think that the people around him, most of them, understand that, you can't repeat what happened in Crimea. That is a rather special case given, Soviet and Russian history. And then you have to think about what kind of foreign adventure. People have looked at Belarus. Belarus is obviously, Lukashenko is showing that, yeah, we're going to get oil from the United States. And, he's allowing demonstrations against a tighter union state. What would Russia really gain by this? And so if you're looking at, Russia's neighbors, of course, we see encroachments even in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, what the Russians are doing there. But a major foreign adventure somewhere else, again, yes, using private military groups or having private military groups increase what they're doing, be it in different African countries, be it in different Latin American countries. We could see some of that, but that's incremental. I do not think that there's any appetite for a major foreign adventure, at least certainly among the Russian population, and probably among a significant, although not a complete part of the Russian elite.
Maria, did you want to weigh in on that one? You follow domestic politics pretty closely.
Yes, there's absolutely a decline in support of foreign policy adventurism especially among the Russian population in the recent years. All the polls show that Russians start prioritizing welfare or social spending over the military one, as I mentioned before. There's multiple surveys that demonstrate the dynamic, and also I did this experiment in which I essentially divided the sample of Russians into two comparable groups, and then showed one of them information about worsening economic situation, and the other group the information about improving economic situation. And so the group that received the information about worsening economic situation in Russia was significantly less likely to back this adventurous geopolitical statements, so to speak, or favor military spending over economic spending. They actually tend to prioritize domestic development and investment in domestic issues over foreign policy issues. This is also revealed in multiple polls that actually favor improving relationships with the West. We have seen this dynamic over the last several years. And of course, it's safe to say that as of now, the Crimea effect that originally gave boost to the Kremlin's approval, Putin's and his elite's approval, is almost completely gone. Russians are tired of the international adventurism. They think that the domestic issues tend to need more attention, and they want the state to refocus on them. The COVID-19 situation in Russia will definitely even further deepen this dynamic. The question is to what extent the Kremlin is able to respond to it. Over the past, we saw that the Kremlin is honestly quite responsive to something that it's on societal level. But as of now, we haven't really seen the Kremlin preparedness to pay to people trying to help them to go through the crisis, so they probably increase the tensions within Russia even further.
Okay, thank you, Maria. We probably got time for one last question. This one's about Nord Stream, which has kind of been in the news as German regulators are taking a very hard look at whether Nord Stream complies with EU law, which I would argue that it doesn't, but that's for the German regulators to decide. This one comes from Romaldas Petevichus. Please forgive me for butchering that what I'm sure is a beautiful Lithuanian name. Is Nord Stream 2 still relevant for both Russia and Europe? Pretty wide open question. But state of Nord Stream right now, as energy prices are falling and we're discussing Russian foreign policy.
Well, I mean, I would say, of course, with decreased energy demand, it looks much less relevant. But, you know, you've got the Gazprom barge has now entered the Danish waters, and it is, you know, they are working on completing the very last stretch of the pipeline. And I would be very surprised if they didn't do that. Now, it's going to take them longer. Clearly, it was supposed to have been completed earlier on this year. But at some point, energy demand will come back. And at least until now, even Merkel herself has said that this is a project that we should go ahead with. Agreed, it doesn't seem as important now, but it would be very surprising if after all of this, it does not get completed.
Maria, anything to add to that?
On the Russian side, the Kremlin is very invested in the project, and honestly, it has not, at least based on the literature that I have read, the importance of this project for European markets is not very clear, since even existing capacity is not fully used by the Kremlin, but Germany has its own reasons to continue. The Kremlin is definitely very, very sold on building it, but it's not clear to what extent it will have the capacity to overcome the obstacles that are put to this project by the United States and European Commission. So we will see. Overall, of course, for the sake of Ukraine and overall the peace in the world, it would have been better to freeze this project, but the fight is not over yet.
Yeah, I know this just doesn't go away. Every time you think it's untouchable, it gets in trouble, and every time you think it's about to be ended, it comes back from the dead. I said that was the last question, but guess what? I lied. I'm really sorry. I'm looking at the clock and I see 5 minutes left, and I actually see an interesting question for you, Maria. Also comes from Salome Pakoria, and it's about whether it is actually oil prices or Putin's ratings that lead to aggressive foreign policy. The question is this: how are the rise in oil prices and people's attitudes towards Putin linked? So we're linking two different variables here. The Levada Center survey shows that in 2008 and in 2014, Putin's approval rating was very low. I wouldn't say it was very low in 2008, but it would, in 14, it was at its lowest point before now. And it dramatically increased right after the war in Georgia and the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Does Putin start wars when oil prices are high or when his approval ratings get low? Maria, you're our expert on public opinion.
If anything, this seems to be somewhat opposite hypothesis, I would say, because oil prices are directly linked to Russia's economic growth, right? Not as strongly as they used to be, now that essentially Russia institutional has been stagnating, but definitely throughout the 2000s. And so if oil prices are high, typically you expect the growth to be higher. And so the ratings of Putin should be on average higher. Here we're saying that when the ratings are low, but oil prices are high, that's actually quite opposite hypothesis if you think of them in terms of this relationship. So first of all, I tested the hypothesis about Putin's approval in my discussed paper, along with the oil prices, among other things, and I did not find a relationship with Putin rating, which is unfortunate. It would be an interesting finding. In 2008, I would argue Putin's approval was not as low. As a matter of fact, he was not really a president at the time. Dmitry Medvedev was in power already, and issues of support for Putin was really not on the agenda at the time. Georgia invasion had to do with some other considerations. When it comes to how about what influenced Putin's approval, you might argue, based on the surveys and talking with Levada Center, is the delayed impact of the 2008 crisis that happened after the invasion, and that had this accumulating dissatisfaction among Russians actually last up until 2011, contributing to 2011, 2012 protests. Despite the fact Putin has actually managed to get reelected in 2012, just remember how people at the time were a little skeptical about that, but did not really create a lot of problems for Putin. And eventually in 2014, when again the Crimea happened, the re-election the questions of re-election were less on the agenda around the time. So if the invasion was really to happen according to the logic of Putin's rating, we should have witnessed something in 2012. Not in 2014, I would argue, but we did not see that. So it's also important to keep in mind that, as I mentioned before, the popularity of these invasions on the popular level has been declining over the years, the concept. So it's questionable to what extent Putin would be able to get the same approval boost right now as he did in 2014, just because people are a little bit tired of the whole geopolitical talk about this aggression they receive on TV, about the Russian TV's coverage is consistently tend to prioritize Ukraine. A lot of people in Russia saying that we want to focus back on Russian domestic politics, etc. So just to sum it up, overall, the evidence is not very much consistent with this approval argument. It's definitely part of the considerations, and when the Kremlin thinks it may be beneficial for Putin's approval to start another war, it may be part of the consideration, but I don't think it has been the key consideration, especially looking at the cases of Ukraine and Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we would call it an intervening variable in this. Before we wrap up, Angela, any last remarks before we end?
No, I don't think so. I mean, just the obvious one that we really don't know how in the longer run this pandemic will affect Russia. I mean, how it will affect global politics, but also Russia domestically, and we may still be surprised. So yeah. Always that caution when you're talking about Russia.
No, I think there's one thing that we can count on is that we will continue to be surprised. So on that note, we will wrap it up. I want to thank our excellent panelists. Maria Snegovaya is a fellow at CEPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. And Angela Stent is director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University and author of the recently published and highly recommended book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Angela Stent also served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department and as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. I also want to remind everybody that on Thursday, 2 days from now, May 14th, I will be hosting another webinar, Gaslighting the Neighbors, how Russia is using active measures against Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova in the age of a global pandemic. And on that note, we'll wrap it up. Also, a big thanks to our virtual audience out there in YouTube land. We'll see you all next time. Thank you.